Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to Bob Paquette, President and Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society, for kindly inviting me to give this year's David Aldrich Nelson Lecture for Constitution Day. You all know that we in America had an extraordinary debate at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. You may have read some of the arguments on one side of the debate, the Federalist Papers. I'd like to speak to you a bit about both the Federalist and their often neglected opponents, the Anti-Federalists, and about an important but neglected influence on the thought of these Anti-Federalists by someone of whom you may have heard, John Adams. I suspect you've heard of his second cousin, Samuel Adams, the brewer. We'll be looking at the thought of Samuel's cousin, John. As you know, the American Constitution was drafted in 1787 in an attempt to correct the failing Articles of Confederation. But my story begins some 6 years before then, in 1781, in France, with a letter written by a man named Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, Baron de Lune. You've probably never heard of him, but to see his importance, consider that there are busts of only two men gracing the entrance to Jefferson's estate at Monticello, Voltaire and Turgot. Turgot was a political economist who served briefly as Louis XVI's finance minister and was an advocate of what we would today call classical liberal economics. Turgot's friend, Dr. Richard Price, an English champion of American independence, had written a work called Additional Observations on Civil Liberty. Having read that work, Turgot published a letter to Price in which he sharply criticized the 13 American state constitutions for slavishly following the British and having three different branches of government. To Turgot, this division of government was a big mistake, for as he saw it, the division merely mimicked the class system of England, in which a monarch served as chief executive. Landed aristocrats occupied the upper house of the legislature, and commoners held the lower house. Such class-based systems, which rested on deep longings for political greatness, belonged to the past, Turgot believed. For liberal ideas and modern commerce were undermining class and hierarchical distinctions in favor of egalitarian commercial republics, which promoted finance and trade rather than glory and honor, and which destroyed aristocracies. Now, when John Adams read Turgot's published letter, deeply annoyed, he sent a series of letters to his son, John Quincy Adams, attacking it. And then he decided it would be best to extend and publish these letters under the title Defense of the Constitutions of the United States. He did that in 1786, just before the proposal for a new federal constitution came out. Adams sought to defend the 13 American state constitutions. But his work decisively influenced how that new proposed federal constitution of 1787 came to be understood by many Americans. So, what did Adams argue against Turgot? Adams insisted that the American system of separation of powers did not slavishly copy the British system. The American system of separation of powers, Adams argued, allowed the representation of three natural classes that have been manifested not only in England, but throughout human history. Adams wrote a book 450 pages long, going through all of world history to make this claim. Three permanent natural classes. And he thereby misled his readers concerning the nature of modern constitutions. Misled by Adams, the Anti-Federalists expected that the proposed federal constitution of 1787 was designed to maintain a class-based system of representation, and they attacked it on the ground that it would fail to do so. Seeing their argument will help us fully grasp the radical nature of the Federalist understanding of the new American regime under which we live. But to make our case, we need to first try to grasp in outline the arguments of Turgot's great predecessors in modern political philosophy, John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu. You may not have heard of them, but they were architects in the greatest social engineering project in human history, which has come to be known as the Enlightenment, and they profoundly influenced both Turgot and the Federalists. Let's look first at the argument of John Locke. Taking up where his proto-liberal predecessor Thomas Hobbes had left off, Locke argued for inalienable, pre-political natural rights, stressing over and against the Bible the poverty of our original state of nature and emphasizing the creation of government as a significant step to escaping this poverty. Yet even before he turns to the discussion of the creation of government in his second treatise, Locke shows that humans in the state of nature are capable of relieving their naturally impoverished condition. The means at our disposal are, in the first place, human labor, encouraged by guarantees of the right to private property. Second, money, as the means of overcoming the natural spoilage limitation on goods, and thereby vastly increasing the desire for gain in human beings. Third, the spread of the arts and sciences, as supplying additional human remedies for the pains and depressions from a harsh and poor nature through technology. And fourth, markets, in which both wages and the prices of goods and services are determined by the laws of supply and demand, rather than by an alleged natural wage or natural price, as the means of rationally distributing the goods and services that the industrious and rational humans produce through their labor, physical and mental. So, where Hobbes had defined the end of government as security and peace, Locke defines it as the regulating and preserving of property. Freedom means for Locke primarily freedom to protect and preserve one's material private property, which, as he defines it, includes one's life and liberty. And in the fifth and most important chapter of the second treatise, Locke lays down the moral foundation of what came to be called capitalism. Here, he claims that justice, or the common good of all humanity, requires a society to devote itself chiefly to encouraging every individual to pursue a limitless, self-interested acquisition of ever more and more private material possessions and economic buying power, money, so long as each person respects the right of each other person to do likewise. In other words, Locke wholly rejects the arguments of the ancient political philosopher Aristotle and the medieval political theologian Thomas Aquinas, who had argued that we must subordinate wealth to the life of virtue, and who saw property as a mere tool while disdaining unlimited acquisition and usury. Locke becomes the first to argue that peacefully competitive acquisition is, paradoxically, the core of a just and moral society. Since our natural condition is not one of abundance, but of poverty, according to Locke, or one in which any uncultivated land is wasteland, reason tells us to subdue the earth by our labor. And the invention of money overcomes the natural limitation of spoilage that had made boundless acquisition appear to be irrational. Money gives men a great incentive to enclose and cultivate through labor the poor land given by nature. And the productivity of that land improves by a factor of 10 or 100 or even 1,000, or as Locke eventually puts it, all value is from human labor. Nature supplies, in truth, almost worthless materials. Since such productivity through human labor and scientific manipulation of nature, technology, increases the common stock of mankind quite dramatically. Moreover, the pursuit of wealth is shown to improve the lot of everyone, lowering the prices of essential goods and services, and thereby serving a genuine common good. While such a system will result in vast inequalities, these inequalities are justified because they greatly elevate the material condition of even the lowest rung of society. In Locke's developing society, all boats rise together, even those of poor wage earners. As a result, property becomes the key right in Locke's political theory, and the government's role in protecting rights turns increasingly to emphasizing the protection of private property, thereby promoting the constant increase of private property. As Locke puts it, the increase of lands and the right employing of them is the great art of government. And a wise prince will be sure, quote, by established laws of liberty to secure protection and encouragement to the honest industry of mankind, end quote. Government should strive to enhance incentives for the working rich and poor, to make everyone see that they can hope by hard work to become more and more prosperous. In the face of the barrenness of nature, such acquisitiveness is not exploitative, for in fact, the greatest benefactors of mankind are the rationally self-interested, the acquisitive, who are industrious. But while Locke thereby provides this great moral justification for the protection and promotion of economic rationality through the practice of the great art of government, he leaves the elaboration of this art to his successors, greatest among whom was Montesquieu. Montesquieu elaborates on the effects of commerce on society and the benefits the state may derive from these effects. One of commerce's chief effects is gentleness or softness, that is, the dissolution of severe, strict, disciplined habits, what Montesquieu calls prejudices, and a corresponding encouragement of indifference to vice and attachment to bodily pleasures and comforts. It is almost a general rule, writes Montesquieu, that wherever there are gentle ways of life, there's commerce, and wherever there's commerce, there are gentle ways of life. Instead of being devoted to one's fatherland, to glory, or to the next life, one is inclined, by dint of the flourishing of commerce, to become attached instead to one's material security, comfort, and refined pleasures. In short, when private acquisition is available through trade, one becomes hardworking, tolerant, and peace-loving, according to Montesquieu. Moreover, commercial intercourse with foreigners and their habits similarly weakens attachment to one's own manner of life as the one right way, causing each individual to understand his own customs as simply one way among many, as prejudices. Strong or unbending attachment to one's particular way of life comes to appear to be the result of mere narrowness. International commerce, in this way, enhances the belief that good and evil, noble and base, beautiful and ugly, are no more than declarations of a person's subjective preferences. By encouraging the acceptance of this principle, commerce encourages a cosmopolitanism based on a recognition of what comes to sight as the true universal needs of humans, namely material security and comfort. The movement of commercial nations trading with one another is thus not only toward peace, it is toward homogeneity. As nations increasingly emphasize their same natural material needs and the pursuit of money, the means to satisfy those needs, they become very similar to one another. In fact, coming to be guided by the pursuit of wealth, all come, in Montesquieu's striking formulation, to be but a single state, of which all societies are members. But in order to attain this peaceful homogeneity to which commerce, manufacture, riches, and luxury all lead, it is necessary, according to Montesquieu, to destroy the pure morals or virtue at which classical republicanism aims. Commerce corrupts moral virtue, commodifying, setting a cash price on all goods and services formerly done out of grace, generosity, hospitality, or attachment to high-mindedness. It does so all the more whenever vanity and all that come in its train, that is, luxury, industry, the arts, fashions, politeness, taste, drives work and exchange of goods and services to new heights. This corroding of moral virtue is not an unfortunate side effect of commerce. It's the very end sought by Montesquieu's promotion of commerce. for he holds such moral virtues to be at odds with genuine human freedom and prospering. As the commercial republic will bring about the atrophy of classical virtues, and with it the end of the deep ambition for honor, glory, and virtuous deeds, so too it is intended to bring about the atrophy of faith in revealed religion. In the heart of the two chapters on religion, in the spirit of the laws, one finds Montesquieu's extraordinary statement that, quote, religion can be most successfully attacked, not by persecution, but by favor, by the conveniences of life, by hope of fortune, by that which makes one forget and throws one into lukewarmness when other passions act on our souls, and those which religion inspires are in silence, end quote. Economic cooperation for satisfying the material wants and needs and entertainment of pacified individuals, rather than principled stands taken on the basis of stern virtue or religious devotion, that is the very aim of Montesquieu's modern commercial republic. These are the central components, then, of the new modern commercial society, and what's more important, its aims. Wiping out deep human longings that had brought about distinct and competing notions of virtue, religion, and ways of life. This is to be achieved by limited government that secures individual rights, especially property rights, the unleashing of human acquisitiveness and commerce. This is the new Enlightenment project that Jacques Turgot, Baron de Lune, was following. Let's look at what Turgot says now. Turgot, too, envisioning a withering of political ambition or of the hunt for glory, envisioning the privatization and softening of stern moral and religious life, and the eclipse by economic life of political life, understood as the life devoted to cultivation of virtues, followed Montesquieu and Locke. He had hoped that the republics being set up in America would eventually put an end to what he considered the deep, deluded longings that had hitherto animated political life. Turgot's letter to Price presents a judgment of the state constitutions in America that encapsulates this desire to see American republics emerge that will be governed by, quote, nature, by reason, and by justice, end quote. That is, Turgot looks for government in accord with modern Lockean Montesquieuian principles. But he finds the state governments that Americans have produced to be deficient in this regard. The American states, he complains, have thoughtlessly imitated the British system of separation of powers by adopting bicameral legislatures and an independent executive. This system, he argues, should be seen for what it truly is, a result of the merely accidental historical circumstances under which the British king is balanced by Parliament, and in Parliament itself, the nobles or aristocrats and the people balance each other. The American states, in which all citizens are equal, have foolishly adopted this class-based system and created divisions and instability where they do not naturally exist. The Americans have given insufficient attention to the fact that there are but two natural classes, propertied and non-propertied. Other classes, he argues, and this would include the classes of the virtuous, the wise, kings by divine right, the clergy, noble families, serfs, Brahmins, etc. All are artificial and should be accorded no specific place in any constitutional arrangement. He claims that a new type of constitution will bring about the death of all artificial classes, a constitution built on the natural distinction between propertied and non-propertied. Finally, Turgot complains that the American states are also foolishly attempting to regulate commerce among themselves, rather than instituting free trade, which should be seen as a corollary of the natural right to property. And Turgot sees quite correctly that this argument has a momentous consequence. In a word, the nation state is finished if the corollary concerning free trade is fully understood. For as Turgot suggests, commerce, and the private property on which it is based, when left to themselves, produce a natural homogeneity among peoples and an equality of economic progress. Leaving each state to regulate its commerce with others will, on the other hand, perpetuate an artificial division of states with diverse laws and manners and opinions. Turgot finds that nature, which speaks universally, will, when followed, eliminate the many and diverse hierarchies, customs, laws, manners, and opinions, and lead to a salutary, rational homogeneity. As he states, the nation has no exalted end. It must simply preserve the freedom of individuals and protect their property against domestic and foreign threats. The nation should therefore recognize that it has only a pretended interest in other things, in conquest, in glory in arms, or even a more pacific desire for the glory of excelling in arts and sciences. If the interests of a nation are pretended interests, as Turgot vigorously repeats, it's because the territory of the nation belongs not to the nation, but to the individual proprietors of the soil. The state exists only to serve those proprietors. Thus, Turgot takes Montesquieu's thesis very far, showing the possibilities of transcending artificial national divisions born of delusional national desires for glory, and turning instead to rely on property rights and free trade to promote rational, peaceful cooperation, what we today call globalization. Turgot argues that states, like individuals, can be reduced to a level of promoting bodily comfort through commerce, turning them away from deeper longings and replacing them with a softer and more rational, peaceful desire for material comfort. Here, then, in the work of its early proponent, and as we see today in its most advanced state in the European Union, the liberal order favors peace over war, prosperity over glory, and physical satisfaction of needs over spiritual responses to higher callings. And it is against this background of the commercial republic that we can now understand the fierce counter-arguments of John Adams and their effect on the debate between the anti-federalists who followed Adams. If Turgot is among the most progressive critics of American constitutionalism at the time of the founding, John Adams is, with good reason, considered one of the most conservative and devoutly Christian of the American founders in matters of religion and morals. In contrast to Turgot's belief that commerce can soften human nature, Adams had faith in an older version of political order to produce dignity and virtuous citizens, morals and character, balancing between what he considers to be the three permanent natural classes of human beings. Unlike Turgot, Adams held that human progress was seen especially in what he called progress in education and society, in knowledge, and in virtue. And this progress, Adams claimed, has come about because of advances in the theory and practice of government, checks and balances, an independent judiciary, and the protection of rights to conscience, speech, and petition. To put Adams in context, we might say that he viewed the modern science of politics as seeking the very same ends as the ancient or classical had done, the good life or virtue, but as employing new political means to attain them. Virtue, as Adams well knew, had been the goal of small ancient regimes, of small republics, not large despotisms. But Adams knew that such republics had hitherto been short-lived, and he believed that the modern science of free government could remedy this by introducing modern notions of representation, of checks and balances, and of a balance of powers in the government in three branches. And the three branches of government brought into being by the new science of politics are an executive, Senate, and a House of Representatives. The branches and the checks on each branch found in the 13 American states are based, Adams argues, on a correct understanding of human nature and its three natural classes. By improving ancient political arrangements with the modern understanding of politics, Adams believed new republics could produce virtue in their citizens and maintain themselves for a much more extended period of time. The balance to which Adams refers, then, is not between powers, executive, legislative, judicial. Instead, it's between partisans of regimes, aristocrats, democrats, monarchists. These members of three grand permanent human parties that promote these three types of rule and indeed three ways of life through legislation, these are, for Adams, the center of the focus of the new science of politics, whose progress consists in understanding how best to balance the three classes in their governing capacities. Adams' understanding of checks and balances relies not on the modern understanding of separation of powers, but on the ancient Aristotelian understanding of the mixed regime of classes. The 13 American states have indeed, according to Adams, created constitutions that balance parties, affording members of each natural party a share in rule. Adams saw the American executive and bicameral legislatures functioning as a complex mixed regime, one he dubs a democratical mixture. Adams' understanding can be best seen, or seen most clearly, by his view of the Senate, the upper chamber. While other American founders conceived of the Senate as a chamber of sober second thought, Adams envisioned it as composed by men of the highest talents and hence as the home, as he puts it, of a scheming, ambitious, aristocratic party, a place to which problematically ambitious men could be ostracized. Thus, we see that Adams actually agrees with Turgot's fundamental claim. The branches of our state governments do indeed reflect and represent three classes. But where Turgot had argued that classes, and with classes, nations, are rightfully disappearing owing to the securing of the individual's right to private property, Adams denies that there will soon be a universal reduction of social classes to two economic ones. He argues with particular vigor that there will always be human beings of an aristocratic bent who think they deserve to rule. It is this ambitious type, above all, that must be checked, he argues, for the sake of preserving the virtuous voice of the people, and thereby preserving the balance needed for free government. Unlike Turgot, Adams does not at all envision a withering of the hunt for glory. And while he condemns the monkery of Catholic priests, he does not foresee the privatization of moral and religious life, nor the eclipse of the political by the economic as the driving force of life. He does not see and does not think that the republics that are being set up in America would end those deep-seated longings that had hitherto animated political life. It is in part because Adams sees the end of government not simply as liberal, not simply as is stated in the Declaration of Independence, but as having as ends the securing of, as he puts it, the lives, liberties, properties, and characters of the citizens, that he sees a natural place for merit or considerations of worth or virtuous deserving as enduring in a new type of government. In his promotion of the new science of politics, Adams is either an unaware foot soldier of the radical enlightenment promoted by Turgot, or a quiet critic of that enlightenment who is intent on maintaining within the modern world a vision of the classical Christian republic. Adams' defense of the constitutions of the United States was faithful, for it was widely read by the anti-federalists, many of whom explicitly cite Adams' arguments, viewing Adams' book as the authoritative explanation of the proposed Constitution's system of separation of branches. The anti-federalists agreed with Adams that a regime balanced by three co-equal orders would be beneficial. Many anti-federalist authors, notably Federal Farmer, Brutus, the signatories of the Pennsylvania Minority Report, Agrippa and Melancton Smith, agreed with Adams that the aristocratic elites and the democratic yeomanry should each be represented in different branches of the government, balancing each other's worst impulses and helping to promote good government. But because none of these anti-federalist authors believed that the proposed Constitution would actually create such a balanced class system in practice, they rejected it for its failure to guarantee what they called the first of all among the political balances, the preservation in its proper station of each of these classes. Tellingly, the Anti-Federalists, in addition to favoring a balance of classes, also favored small republics, in which a similarity of mores and the promotion of virtue was possible. Indeed, these favorings form the very basis of their rejection of the proposed large, extended, or consolidated republic. The states as small republics and schools of virtue encouraged, they argued, manly virtues, the virtues of a free people, good morals, religion, temperance, a moderate, healthy ambition, and avoidance of corrupting foreign mixtures. The Anti-Federalists believed that these virtues would come to fruition primarily in the substantial yeomanry of the country, while the first men of the community, the aristocrats, would be, quote, licentious, assuming, and overbearing, end quote, especially those from the slave-holding southern states. Brutus, citing the proposed Constitution's 3/5 clause, condemns the slaveholding aristocracy that holds men in bondage, quote, in defiance of every idea of benevolence, justice, and religion, and contrary to all the principles of liberty, end quote. These arguments, too, are clearly suffused with a dependence on Adams' understanding of different classes or orders of men. Indeed, on the basis of Adams' book, the Anti-Federalists predicted that the proposed Constitution would actually create what they called an aristocratical government, favoring rule by the wealthy and even tending toward hereditary offices. The Senate, they argued, would lean toward aristocracy by its prominence and position, and the president would presumably come from the same upper crust of American society. And these two aristocratic institutions would be further united by their common functions. For, they pointed out, the Constitution requires close cooperation between the president and the Senate on federal appointments and the ratification of treaties. And while the aristocratic and monarchic orders would be represented in the Senate and in the person of the chief executive, they argued, the common people would not be represented as a class. Even large states, after all, would send fewer than a dozen members to the House, thereby guaranteeing that only the first men in the state would gain election, while the class they called the people would be excluded from office. America's democratic middle class, that is, would be shut out of government, and the aristocrats, only rarely coming into contact with the common man, would be detached from the day-to-day concerns and economic interests of their constituents. As Brutus concluded, although the House was purported to be the democratic branch, in truth, it offered little more than the shadow of representation. The capital city would be filled with the great and mighty of the earth, he argued, and these lordly and high-minded rulers, rich men north of Richmond, would willingly sacrifice the public good to advance their own interests and perpetuate their positions. The people, the common yeoman, would be well represented only if they could choose men from among themselves and genuinely like themselves. So representatives should resemble those they represent. They should be a true picture of the people. The resulting involvement of the yeomanry would, they insisted, yield tremendous benefits. By bringing the yeomanry into the government, the community would benefit from the solid, middling virtues which marked it. Moreover, the Anti-Federalists argued that only if the governing and the governed shared the same interests would good government be possible. Unless the middle class was suitably represented in the legislature, the government would become wholly aristocratic, and its members would neither understand nor sympathize with their constituents' interests. But if the government, or at least one branch of it, represented the common man, then the yeomanry's representatives would enact policies that would benefit the middle class. In this way, and only in this way, could the rulers be counted on to promote the good of that class called the people. Sympathy and attachment were the keys to good government. The Anti-Federalists linked suitable representation to lawfulness, patriotic virtue, and the maintenance of free government. They argued that only small regimes allowed a people to elect rulers similar to themselves, rulers who would write laws beneficial to the people's interests. As a result of such elections, the common man would be attached to the rulers in the regime. He would willingly obey the law, thereby limiting the government's need to employ coercion and force. Conversely, the anti-federalists predicted that in a large republic, this tie of sympathy, empathy between the people and their rulers would be missing, and with it, patriotic virtue. They predicted that a large regime under the Supremacy Clause would enforce the law by means of powerful standing armies, obedient to the central government, all but ensuring that despotism would eventually arise. In short, the anti-federalists adopted Adams' understanding of balanced representation of three permanent classes. And as a result, they rejected the Constitution because they saw it would fail to achieve this goal. The government would not adhere to the true principles of representation, for the three natural classes would not be represented. And without suitable representation for all three classes, the anti-federalists predicted unfair, aristocratical legislation and a quick decline into despotism. From Adams and the anti-federalists, we turn now to the final chapter in this story, to the Federalist Papers. In answering the anti-federalists' charges that the new Constitution would result in aristocracy and despotism, the Federalists did not take the obvious course of action. They did not defend the American republicanism by insisting that the Constitution would ensure full representation of monarchic, aristocratic, and democratic classes. Instead, they focused on the new type of representation more broadly. It's easy to miss the import of this momentous choice, for the Federalists refused directly to address the question of class and entailed a complete rejection of the terms of debate that had been proposed by the anti-federalist opponents. The Federalists instead argued for an understanding of the proposed Constitution that was based on the Lockean Montesquieuian concept of property, commerce, and modern government, one much closer to Turgot's than to Adams. Rejecting the anti-federalist claim that the new government would promote a class-based aristocracy, then, the Federalists attacked the anti-federalist understanding of representation at its core. They quietly rejected the anti-federalist contention that the government should directly represent all the different classes of citizens to produce a due sympathy between the representative body and its constituents, as they argued in Federalist 35. The Federalists argued that a modern commercial regime would allow individuals to transcend class interests and create unity across economic interests. Most critically, the Federalists show that modern commerce will unite all citizens around a single goal of money-making, thus creating broad-based shared economic interests. That is, the Federalists embraced much of the Lockean Montesquieuian argument, proposing a system that strove to bring about the leveling equality and peace and stability that comes with a modern commercial republic. As they write in Federalist 9, the United States has learned from the, quote, history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy, which, despite the fleeting brilliancy of their nascent republican governments, were continually plagued by domestic faction and insurrection. The modern science of politics, they argue, has developed models of a more perfect structure, relying on principles of government not known or imperfectly known to the ancients. These great improvements of the new science of politics are separation of powers, legislative checks and balances, an independent judiciary, representative government, and most importantly, the enlargement of the orbit, the extended sphere of government so famously expounded in Federalist 10. In embracing the enlarged orbit, looking toward an unprecedented, single, extended large republic, rather than one constrained by the size of the traditional polis, the Federalists acknowledged that the new American Constitution rejects what they call, quote, a blind veneration for antiquity, end quote. It looks instead to a regime, quote, which has no parallel in the annals of human society, end quote. Critical to this new experiment is the role of free commerce, which helps to avoid the petty factional conflicts of the ancients precisely by turning men from the deep-seated desire for virtue, glory, or moral excellence, and toward the infinitely safer, from the Federalist perspective, desire for profit. The proposed United States Constitution clearly laid the groundwork for a commercial republic. Let's remember that prior to the addition of the Bill of Rights, the sole mention of rights in the unamended document was the reference to Congress's power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by protecting patents and copyrights. Second, the economic powers granted to Congress, in combination with the powers specifically denied the states, all but guaranteed free trade and promoted centralized control over the nation's economy. Congress is given broad tax powers to impose duties on imports, the power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce, to fix standard weights and measures, to coin money and regulate its value, and to enact uniform rules for bankruptcies. The 13 states, by contrast, lost the authority to coin or print money, lay duties on imports or exports, except in very limited circumstances, or impair the obligations of contracts. Finally, the Constitution forbade taxes or duties on the exports of states and banned preferential regulations which would benefit one state or its shipping over another. These powers, as Forrest McDonald says, enshrined in fundamental law a broad modern conception of contracts, allowed Congress to promote manufacturing through protective tariffs, and ensured that no matter what system of political economy was adopted, internally, the United States would be the largest area of free trade in the world. The Federalists pointed to the many benefits of a single united government with broad powers to control foreign and internal commerce, advantageous trade relations with Europe, promotion of a robust, diversified economy, and sufficient power to ensure American access to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Moreover, a union that encompassed commercial unity would discourage jealousy and harmful rivalry among the states, while encouraging increased trade. Unrestrained intercourse between the states would guarantee that the veins of commerce in every part, I'm quoting now from the Federalist, will be replenished and will acquire additional motion and vigor from the free circulation of the commodities of every part, advancing trade at home and abroad. Tellingly, to the Federalists, these commercial benefits were central, not ancillary, to the new constitutional project. Indeed, promotion of commerce would become one of the national government's primary objectives. They put this very strikingly and directly, saying that in the realm of modern politics, the, quote, prosperity of commerce has become a primary object of the political cares of enlightened statesmen. Following Locke, the Federalists believed that promotion of commercial success was a significant part of the modern great art of government. Notably, the Federalists explicitly aligned this great art with the project of unleashing mankind's avarice. The union of the states, in addition to the freedoms and property rights guaranteed by the Constitution, would encourage, they argued, a beneficial acquisitiveness. As they put it in Federalist 11, by multiplying the means of gratification, by promoting the introduction and circulation of the precious metals, those darling objects of human avarice and enterprise, commerce serves to vivify and invigorate all the channels of industry and to make them flow with greater activity and copiousness. It's by promoting this gratification of human avarice that the country has benefited, as the unequaled spirit of enterprise, as they put it, and the genius of the American merchants and navigators is unleashed through modern commerce. This Lockean praise of enterprise promoting money is striking, but equally important is what the commercial republic is said to mean concerning the orders of men. Adam's three orders or classes are quietly replaced by, quote, the assiduous merchant, the laborious husbandman, the active mechanic, and the industrious manufacturer, end quote. Everyone, that is working for money. There will be no leisured aristocratic nor monarchic class in this new republic, and each order is defined by its job classification. Economic interests would replace what Adams had considered permanent and static social classes. It's because of the uniting interests in profit, which undermines traditional class distinctions, that the Federalists so easily disregard the Anti-Federalist demand for mirrored representation. While the Anti-Federalists insisted that representatives must share a common way of life with their constituents, Federalist 35 contends that the people do not even wish to vote for men like themselves, but will consistently choose those with superior political ability, those most capable of navigating the legislative process. Mechanics and manufacturers, they argue, will not support the election of other manufacturers or mechanics, but will always be inclined to give their votes to merchants in preference to persons of their own professions or trades because their interests can be more effectively promoted by the merchant, whose influence and weight and superior requirements render them more equal to a contest in the public councils. The Federalists did not expect a mechanic to promote the good of some economic interest at the expense of his own, but they did predict that a mechanic might recognize that he would benefit more by the election of a merchant skilled in the political arts than by the election of another mechanic. Interests drive men, and skill advances interest. Even more important, Publius saw that the issue went far beyond the skill of the political candidate in parliamentary procedure. A mechanic might vote for a merchant, trusting the merchant to advance his interests because he knows that their economic interests are intertwined. Representatives, without holding the very same interest as their constituents, would nevertheless have, quoting now from Federalist 12, interests intimately blended and interwoven with those of their constituents, thereby all but guaranteeing that their self-interests would drive them to protect both their own economic interests and the interests of those they represent. Thus, the Federalists argued, self-love and interest will help to promote good government. The Anti-Federalists had a notion of interests so narrowly focused on class interests that it failed to account for a complex modern economy in which various commercial interests are closely connected and interreliant. The process of transcending regime-based divisions, the class divisions, begins by showing that all humans are united by a common interest, money. And it moves to show how a modern commercial republic intimately intertwines various modes of money-making to further complicate the process. Federalist 10 famously elaborates on this argument concerning control of factions by extension of the sphere of popular government. Although Federalist 10 is remembered for its emphasis on property-based factions, it is other factions based on deep longings, that trouble the Federalists the most. Attachment to a particular religion, as Madison puts it, form of government, or different leaders create dangerous factional conflicts, inflaming the citizenry with mutual animosity and enkindling the most violent conflicts and oppression. It is these sorts of factional conflicts based on deep, impassioned views that rest on a foundation prior to or beyond reason, that the Federalists believe arouse the most violent internecine conflicts and multiply the number of economic, commercial interests through a large-scale republic would draw upon the pacifying nature of trade to ameliorate these more deadly forms of factional conflict. Property-based factions are the most manageable precisely because they rely on rational self-interest. As the Federalists argue, the uniting factor between all classes or orders of men is love of wealth. Quote, all look forward with eager expectation and growing alacrity to this pleasing reward of their toils. And neither side must, in order to attain that wealth, devote itself to the destruction of the other. The rich want simply to remain rich. The poor want to join the rich in their success. All factions seek money. All may accumulate more through vigorous modern commerce. The faithful handmaid of labor and industry in every shape is modern commerce. Cooperation, rather than bloodletting, is the proper outlet for the energies of commercial competitors. And an extended republic will ensure a plurality of small economic interests. But the Federalists also recognize the benefits that flow from the vast fluidity and interconnectedness of a modern economy. Not only will the membership of these economic classes change as individuals shift them and new generations and circumstances alter the relative influence of each, but the alliances between classes will vary over time. The fluidity of a modern economy will allow a vast variety of constantly changing coalitions. Coalitions formed by both the possession of different degrees of property, as they put it, and the possession of different kinds of property. A laborer working in manufacture will recognize his common interest with other laborers in every field, but he will also recognize that he's intimately tied to the interests of everyone engaged in manufacture. From his employer to moneyed investors or wealthy carriers of manufactured goods. The Federalists proposed factions that would undermine both rigid classes and rigid factions, creating shifting coalitions of economic interests that will form the many small, diverse factions that block each other and prevent majority tyranny. As Martin Diamond points out, the Federalists envisioned a society in which, quote, men will tend to think in terms of their various immediate economic interests. That is, to think as members of an interest group rather than of a class. Classes, as understood in an older, more traditional sense, would disappear. Every man, regardless of his economic interest, would be essentially equal as a member of the great body of the people. By replacing social classes with economic and interest-based groups, the Federalists quietly rejected Adams' argument and suggested that Turgot was correct, for the United States would overcome the old classes and allow greater social mobility and economic freedom. Relatedly, they did not promise that the new Constitution would successfully promote stern, rigorous Republican virtues. Instead, the Federalist argument for a commercial republic showed how modern commerce and a plurality of small economic factions could reduce the risk of majority tyranny and promote peaceful cooperation, even between citizens animated by self-interest. Let me conclude the story. The discourse between Turgot and Adams points to two positions that exerted significant influence over the ratification debate of 1787 to 1789. Adams' argument looks back to an ancient understanding of politics. Because of Adams' misunderstanding of American constitutionalism, the Anti-Federalists presented lengthy diatribes against a perceived threat of aristocratic government. In this, they were misled, and their critique missed the point. The Federalists had something altogether different in mind. The new science of politics of Locke and Montesquieu would provide a novel and more stable foundation for free and limited government. A modern commercial republic would unleash the acquisitiveness of humans, overcoming traditional class boundaries and replacing them with the complex relationships that come with economic deal-making and competition. Class interests would be replaced by fluid economic interests, and as a result of the economic freedom and upward and downward mobility promised by the commercial republic. Had the Anti-Federalists more fully understood what was at stake, had they better understood how the argument for a modern, classless commercial republic had been accepted by the Federalists, they might have presented a very different argument, more pointed in its critique of luxury, trade, and intermixture with foreign nations. They might have been able to produce a keen critique of the modern commercial republic. Indeed, they might even have won the debate. Thank you.